At 6:41 on March 15, 1941, the wind cuts down through the granite folds above Keren, Eritrea. It is still cool in the high ground, but the sun is already turning the valley into a glare trap. On a shelf of rock overlooking the Dongolaas Gorge, a 22-year-old New Zealand infantryman, Private Jack Mallory, 21st Battalion, lies flat behind a spine of broken stone, his chest pressed into dust and thorn. He is not a trained sniper. He is not even supposed to be here. He is a farm boy from Canterbury. Before the war, he cut fence lines, herded stock, and learned what distance looks like when there is nothing to block the horizon. Now he is a rifleman in a campaign most people back home cannot place on a map. And at 6:41, his section commander is whispering 2 orders into his ear. Watch the saddle. Don't fire unless you're sure. Mallory's rifle is a No.1 Mk III Lee-Enfield .303 British 10-round magazine. Bolt action. Charger loaded. Rough walnut furniture darkened by sweat and sand. It looks like every other infantry rifle in the battalion, except for the small details Mallory has tuned by hand. The front sight blade filed to a crisp post, the rear sight ladder checked for wobble, the sling set tight enough to lock his left arm like a brace. 2 men behind him think it is a joke that the farm boy insists on using it for long shots. At 6:52, down in the scrub and boulders across the gorge, an Italian soldier moves between shadows, trying to find the line of approach the New Zealanders used the night before. He is not alone. Italian forces around Keren, regulars and colonial troops under Italian officers, have been holding these ridges for weeks. They have machine gun nests that command the road. They have mortars dialed in on obvious staging points. And they have learned that if they give the Commonwealth troops a clear run, the ridgeline will be lost. At 6:57, the Italian soldier pauses at a rock that looks like it was placed there to break up the outline of a man. He crouches. He brings his own rifle up, muzzle searching. Mallory does not lift his head. He inches the Lee-Enfield forward until the fore end is resting on a flat stone. The rifle weighs about 9 pounds loaded, but right now the weight is an advantage. It stays still. He breathes in through his nose and holds it. His cheek settles into the stock. He has already measured the range. Not with a tape. Not with a scope. With the hard math of terrain. The saddle across the gorge is roughly 500 yards. A long shot with iron sights. The kind of shot men argue about in tents and then refuse to take when it matters. At 6:58, Mallory adjusts the rear sight. He sets it to 500. He does it without looking. He does not fire. Not yet. Because he knows what the rifle will do. He also knows what the rifle will not do. A Lee-Enfield at 500 yards can hit a man. But the .303 Mk7 round, 174 grains, drops hard as distance stretches. Even with the sight set, the shooter has to read the air. He has to compensate for wind he cannot feel. And the target has to give him a second. At 7:01, the Italian soldier straightens. For a moment his chest is square to the gorge. His head turns left. He is looking for the flash of movement that would betray a New Zealander climbing. Mallory's finger tightens. The rifle cracks once. Sharp. Flat. The recoil is a shove into bone. The Italian soldier folds. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. He simply collapses behind the rock he trusted. At 7:02, Mallory cycles the bolt. The Lee-Enfield's action is fast when it is run correctly. Up, back, forward, down. The extractor snaps. The new round slides into the chamber. He is ready again in under 2 seconds, but he does not fire. He waits. At 7:06, a second Italian appears, half running, half sliding over stone to reach the first man. He stops too close. He bends. He exposes himself. Mallory fires again. The second man drops hard and does not get up. At 7:08, the section behind Mallory goes quiet. Nobody says, "Good shot." Nobody congratulates him. They are listening for the response. At 7:11, the response arrives, a burst of machine gun fire from higher ground, raking the rock shelf where Mallory lies. Chips of stone snap into the air. Dust smears his face. The sound is not loud like movies. It is a violent tearing noise, close enough to make the stomach tighten. Mallory does not lift his head. He crawls backward 2 feet, slow, careful, dragging the rifle with him. He knows the rule. If you fire from one spot twice, you do not fire from it a third time. At 7:19, an Italian mortar round lands 50 yards downslope. The blast is muffled by rock, but the concussion rolls through the gorge like a fist. Shrapnel ticks off stone. The section commander leans close to Mallory's ear. "Are you sure?" he asks. Not accusing. Just trying to decide whether to commit the section to a climb based on 2 fallen shapes in the distance. Mallory answers without emotion. "2 down," he says. Saddles watched. "There'll be more." To understand what is happening on this ridge at 7:19 on March 15th, you have to understand Keren. Keren is not a single battlefield. It is a choke point, a gateway between the coastal capital of Massawa and the highland routes toward Asmara. The Italians have made it a fortress out of terrain. There are ridges, Sanchil, Briggs Peak, Mount Dongolaas, names that will mean something only to the men who bled there. The road runs through a gorge that can be dominated by any machine gun placed intelligently. Attackers have to climb rock faces under fire. Defenders can fall back 10 yards and still keep the same angles. By March 1941, Commonwealth forces have been fighting through Eritrea and Ethiopia for months. The East African campaign is not the war that headlines follow. It does not have Paris or Stalingrad or Midway. But it is a real war, with real units, and it matters. Every Italian position that falls here removes pressure on Egypt. Every port denied to Italy changes the naval picture in the Red Sea. On this morning, the New Zealanders are one component of a larger force pressing the Italians out of Keren. They are tired. Water is rationed. Ammunition is carried by men and mules. Wounded have to be dragged down slopes under fire. A single machine gun can halt an entire company if it is placed right. That is why a rifleman with good eyes suddenly becomes valuable. At 8:03, Mallory and his section shift positions again, crawling along rock like lizards. He can hear the distant engine of a truck in the gorge. He can smell cordite from someone else's fire drifting on the wind. His Lee-Enfield is gritty with dust. He keeps the bolt closed when he moves. He keeps the muzzle capped with his hand when he crawls. At 8:17, he sights the saddle again from a new angle. The light is worse now. Heat is rising. Mirage starts to shimmer off the stone. At long range, mirage is not just a visual effect. It bends targets. It makes men look like they're moving when they are not. At 8:29, a third Italian shows himself, only briefly, at the edge of a boulder. Mallory does not fire. The man is too smart. Too little exposed. The odds are wrong. At 8:41, Mallory sees something that matters more than a single rifleman, a flash of metal, low in a crevice, then the unmistakable shape of a machine gun barrel shifting. It is the kind of thing that kills men during an assault. The kind of thing that pins a platoon halfway up a slope with no cover. Mallory watches it for 90 seconds. At 8:43, he ranges it in his head. The distance is still around 500 yards. The target is small. The gunner is behind cover. But the barrel has to come out to fire. And gunners, good ones, tend to return to the same position. At 8:45, the machine gun opens up. The burst cuts across a lower rock line where another New Zealand section is preparing to move. The tracers draw a bright, brief line in the air. At 8:46, Mallory fires. He is not shooting at the barrel. He is shooting at the space behind it, where the gunner's head has to be, where a man's face has to press into the sights. The machine gun stops. Not forever, but long enough. At 8:49, his section commander makes the decision. He signals 2 men forward. They begin to climb. Behind Mallory, one of the skeptics finally speaks. Quiet. Almost reluctant. Maybe that farm rifle's doing all right, he says. Mallory does not answer. He is already watching for the response, because he knows what happens next. When you silence one gun on a ridge like this, another one wakes up. And the Italians have been holding Keren long enough to know exactly how to make a man regret showing his head. At 9:02 on March 15, 1941, the first counterburst comes from above and left, high ground that Mallory cannot see from his position. The rounds snap overhead and smash into the slope behind him. They are not aimed at him specifically. They are aimed at the line. The Italians are not trying to kill a single rifleman. They are trying to flatten the entire assault. At 9:07, Mallory hears the sound that changes the rhythm of the ridge, a mortar team adjusting. It is a soft thunk, almost gentle, followed by the delayed roar of impact. The first round lands long. The second lands short. That is not random. That is bracketing. At 9:11, the third mortar round lands close enough to throw dust into his mouth. A rock fragment cuts his cheek. He tastes iron and grit. He keeps his head down and waits for the fourth round, because the fourth is usually the one that kills you. At 9:13, the fourth lands 30 yards to the right, walking toward the shelf. Mallory rolls backward, dragging the rifle by the sling. He does it without lifting his profile above the rock. He moves like a man who has spent his life avoiding the kick of a horse, low, controlled, never giving the danger a clean angle. At 9:16, the section commander shouts 2 words that are almost lost under gunfire. Hold! Hold! The men climbing ahead freeze in place, pressed against stone. One slips, catches himself, and stays still. A falling man draws fire. A moving man draws fire. At 9:17, Mallory crawls into a new nook between 2 boulders. He brings the Lee-Enfield up, checks the chamber with a fingertip, then sets the rear sight back down to 400. The line of fire has changed. The saddle is still 500. The machine gun position is closer. At 9:21, he sees an Italian runner, a dispatchman, moving along the ridge line in short dashes, carrying something in his left hand. Not a rifle. Not a pack. A message case, or a spare belt, or a grenade bundle. At this distance, it is hard to tell, but the movement is certain. Mallory does not rush the shot. He tracks the runner through his iron sights. He waits for the man to pause. The runner pauses behind a rock to catch breath. At 9:22, Mallory fires. The runner drops. The object in his left hand tumbles and disappears behind stone. At 9:24, Mallory cycles the bolt and looks for the second man that usually follows a runner, someone sent to find out what happened. He sees movement almost immediately. A head and shoulder, low. A cautious approach. Mallory does not fire. The cautious man is doing everything right. Only a fraction shows. It is a bad shot, and Mallory knows his limits. That discipline, knowing when not to shoot, is what separates a man who hits from a man who merely makes noise. At 9:31, the cautious man retreats. The ridge goes quiet for 7 minutes, except for distant small arms and the occasional whip crack of a bullet passing near stone. At 9:38, the machine gun Mallory had interrupted earlier starts again, from a slightly different position. The Italians have shifted it 10 yards. That is enough to change the angle on the New Zealand climb route. At 9:40, the burst catches one of the climbers. The man jerks and goes limp against the rock. He does not fall. His hands are still gripping stone like he is trying not to die. At 9:41, the section commander swears once, then forces his voice back into control. He signals for smoke. A runner crawls to pass the signal down the slope. At 9:44, Mallory looks at the machine gun and makes a decision that is not written in any manual. He will not try to hit the gunner's head. Not now. The mirage is stronger. The angle is worse. Instead, he watches the bursts. He watches the rhythm of the gun. He watches where the gun returns after recoil. At 9:46, the gun fires again. The barrel is out. The gunner is locked into the position. Mallory fires. The burst stops midstream. The barrel dips out of sight. At 9:47, Mallory fires a second time into the same space, because he knows what happens when a gun stops. The assistant gunner leans in to correct it. The gun does not return. At 9:52, smoke begins to drift across the lower slope, thick, white, imperfect cover. It does not hide the men completely, but it fractures the enemy's aim. The climbers move again, low, pulling themselves up like they are climbing a wall. Mallory stays still. He is not climbing. He is anchoring. By 10:10 on March 15th, Mallory has 3 confirmed kills at long range. He does not count them like trophies. He counts them like a farmer counts fence posts, because each one has an effect on the line. His section commander does not call him a sniper. Not yet. In Commonwealth infantry doctrine of the period, snipers exist, but not in the modern sense. Specialized sniper schools are still limited. Many units improvise. They use men who can shoot, and they give them a mission: deny the enemy the freedom to expose himself. Mallory is doing that with a standard service rifle and iron sights, in a landscape where every movement is punished. The Lee-Enfield is not a sniper rifle. It is an infantry rifle built for volume and reliability. The No.1 Mk III * has a 10-round magazine, double what many contemporary bolt guns carry, and it can be loaded rapidly with 5-round stripper clips. A trained rifleman can fire fast without losing his sight picture. In British training, that emphasis on rapid aimed fire becomes a doctrine in itself. On paper, it is to stop mass assaults. In practice, it also gives a man like Mallory the ability to take a second shot before the enemy understands where the first came from. But the rifle has limitations. At 500 yards with iron sights, the front post covers a large portion of a man's body. The trigger is military weight. The ammunition is not match grade. The barrel heats. The shooter has to solve all of it, under fire. Mallory solves it because he has spent years shooting across open ground with no reference points except wind and distance. And because he is scared enough to be careful. At 10:23, the Italians change tactics. Instead of showing single men, they send 2-man teams. One draws attention. One watches for the muzzle flash. They begin firing at likely positions, not waiting for targets. At 10:31, a burst hits the rock edge in front of Mallory's muzzle and sends a shard into his left forearm. It is not a deep wound, but it bleeds. Blood slicks his hand. He wipes it on his trousers and keeps the sling tight, because a loose sling is the difference between a steady sight picture and a miss. At 10:38, the section commander crawls up to him again. "How many rounds you got?" he asks. Mallory does the math. He started with 50 in bandoliers, plus 10 in the magazine. He has fired 5. He has cycled more. He has enough, but not endless. "Plenty," he says, "if they keep showing themselves." At 10:44, an Italian helmet appears above a rock for less than a second. It is bait. Mallory does not shoot the helmet. He watches where the helmet came from. He watches for the hand. The helmet rises again. At 10:45, Mallory fires at the edge of the rock where the head must be when the helmet lifts. The helmet drops, and this time it does not rise again. At 10:49, The Italians answer with a mortar round aimed directly at his last known position. It lands close enough to throw fragments into his rifle stock. The rifle survives. The wood is scarred. The front handguard splinters slightly. Mallory checks the sights. He checks the bolt. He checks the magazine. He loads 2 more rounds from a clip and keeps going. At 11:03, a small group of Italians, 4 men, attempts to reposition along a narrow ledge to reinforce a higher position. They move in a line, crouched, one behind another. It is a mistake made under pressure. They are trying to solve a problem quickly. Mallory watches them. He does not shoot the first man. He shoots the third. The third drops and blocks the ledge. The second stumbles. The fourth tries to reverse. The line collapses into confusion. At 11:04, Mallory fires again. The second man goes down. The remaining 2 scramble back into cover, leaving bodies on the ledge that make movement even harder. At 11:09, the section commander's voice is different now. He is not skeptical. He is practical. "Keep them pinned," he says. "We're taking the crest." At 11:17, the New Zealand climbers reach a point where they can throw grenades upward. The sound of explosions becomes sharper, closer. The fight is no longer just at 500 yards. It is within shouting distance. At 11:23, Mallory sees an Italian officer, distinct posture, binoculars, a pistol at his hip, lean out to look down the slope. Officers do that when they are trying to control men who are losing control. Mallory has 1 clear second. He sets the sight to 500 again. He fires. The officer disappears behind the rock and does not reappear. At 11:31, the ridge line falters. Italian fire becomes less coordinated. Not gone. Not defeated. But disrupted. The assault inches forward. At 11:38, the section commander finally says the sentence that changes Mallory's role. "You're not with the section anymore," he tells him. "You're with me. You shoot what I point at." Mallory nods once. He doesn't smile. He doesn't protest. He simply shifts his position to maintain sight lines. Because he understands something the others are still learning. A single rifle, in the right hands, can change what an entire ridge feels safe doing. That afternoon, March 15th, the Italians will counterattack. They will use mortars, machine guns, and the terrain to try to take back the ground. The New Zealanders will dig in where they can, scraping shallow sangars out of rock. The dead will stay where they fell, because there is no safe way to retrieve them in daylight. And Mallory will keep shooting. Not because he wants to, but because the ridge demands it. By nightfall, he will have 4 confirmed kills at long range and several more likely hits that nobody can verify in the dust and distance. And the men who mocked his Farmboy Lee-Enfield will stop mocking anything. Because they are watching, in real time, what disciplined marksmanship does to an enemy that relies on exposing itself for even a second. And the campaign is not over. Not even close. At 1812 on March 15, 1941, the light drains out of the gorge and the temperature drops fast. The ridge stops being a battlefield you can see and becomes one you can only feel, through sound, through concussion, through the sudden, close crack of a rifle fired at shapes. Mallory stays awake in 20-minute intervals. He does not sleep properly. He cannot. His mind keeps replaying distance and angles the way a man counts steps in the dark. At 20:06, a ration party crawls up with water tins and ammunition. The tins are dented. The water tastes of metal and dust. Mallory drinks anyway. He cleans the Lee-Enfield with an oily rag and the edge of a shirt sleeve. He checks the front sight for chips. He checks the bolt face for grit. The rifle is a machine, and machines fail when they are ignored. At 22:41, Italian flares rise over the ridge, white light that turns everything into harsh contrast. Everyone freezes. A flare makes any movement a confession. At 22:44, the Italians fire blindly into likely positions. Bullets snap into rock. Men press deeper into stone. At 23:19, Mallory hears a voice behind him, one of the skeptics from earlier, now whispering like he doesn't want to disturb the rifle. "You ever shoot rabbits at night?" the man asks. Mallory keeps his eyes forward. "No," he says. "Only in daylight." At 23:22, the man doesn't speak again. At 5:18 on March 16th, the ridge wakes up. It begins with mortar fire, slow, deliberate. Italian gunners are not wasting rounds. They are walking impacts along the crest line where the New Zealanders scraped their shallow cover. The pattern is meant to force men to keep their heads down while machine guns sweep the obvious gaps. At 5:27, a round lands close enough to cave in part of the stone lip in front of Mallory's position. He flinches, but he doesn't move. If you move during a bracket, you help the next round find you. At 5:34, the section commander, now effectively Mallory's handler, crawls in beside him. He has a map folded into a rectangle, marked with pencil lines and grease smears. He points with a dirty fingernail. "See that notch," he says. "They use it to move between pits." Mallory looks through the notch with naked eyes first, then through his iron sights. The notch is a shallow depression between boulders about 480 to 520 yards away depending on the line. It is not dramatic terrain. It is exactly the kind that matters. At 5:41, a helmet appears in the notch. A man crouches, then rises just enough to step. He is moving under the assumption that the pre-dawn haze and the enemy's exhaustion make him safe. Mallory's rear sight is already set to 500. He has learned that forcing himself to adjust under pressure costs seconds he cannot spare. At 5:42, he fires. The man in the notch drops out of sight. Not a stumble. A collapse. Mallory cycles the bolt. He waits. At 5:46, another man appears in the notch, this time dragging something. Maybe a box, maybe a belt. He pauses. He looks toward the New Zealand crest, trying to read what he cannot see. At 5:47, Mallory fires again. The second man falls forward into the notch and disappears behind stone. The handler doesn't cheer. He doesn't even nod. He just marks something on the map, because he has learned that Mallory's rifle is now part of the unit's fire plan. Another weapon system, like a Bren gun, like a mortar, except it reaches into places the others can't. By 6 o'clock, Mallory has 6 confirmed kills over 2 days. At 6:18, the Italians adapt again. They stop sending obvious movers. Instead, they begin using decoys and peekers, men whose job is to show a sliver of helmet or shoulder to draw fire, while another man watches for the muzzle flash. It's an old technique. It works when the shooter loses discipline. Mallory stays disciplined. At 6:26, a helmet rises above a rock, slow, deliberate. Mallory does not fire at the helmet. He watches the rock face where the helmet must be held. He watches for fingers. He watches for the slight shift of a body's weight. At 6:28, he sees it, a tiny movement at the rock's right edge. A cheek. A sliver of eye line. He fires once. The helmet drops and this time rolls away as if the hand holding it has let go. At 6:33, the Italians respond with concentrated machine gun fire on the area Mallory last fired from. The ridge erupts in stone chips. A round punches through the lee side of a boulder and sprays dust into his face. At 6:34, Mallory moves. 2 feet. 3. Not enough to abandon the position, but enough to change the line. Enough to deny the enemy a repeat angle. At 6:41, the handler points again. "Same notch," he says. "They'll try it again." At 6:49, they do. A man crawls into the notch, staying low. He is trying to move wounded or dead. That is the grim truth. In this terrain, bodies become obstacles, and someone has to clear them if the position is to function. Mallory watches for 10 seconds. He sees the man's back rise as he tries to lift. At 6:50, Mallory fires. The man in the notch slumps and does not rise again. That makes 7. By 8:05 on March 16th, the sun is high enough to burn away the haze. Now mirage becomes the enemy. Heat waves rise off rock and distort everything past 300 yards. At 500, the target seems to shimmer. This is where many good shots stop being good shots. The Lee-Enfield's iron sights are precise, but the front post is still a post. At long range, it covers a man's head and chest as one block. Mirage makes the block swim. Mallory compensates by using something he learned on open land. He stops trying to aim at the man. He starts aiming at reference points, edges of stone, dark cracks, the line where shadow meets light. He places the front post on a fixed point and waits for the man to intersect it. At 8:19, the Italians attempt a small countermove along a traverse line just below the crest. 2 men at a time. One crouched, one bent. They are using the terrain intelligently, moving when bursts from their own machine guns cover them. Mallory doesn't chase them. He watches the traverse. He picks the moment they must step over an exposed patch where the rock line breaks. At 8:27, one man steps into that patch. His boot lands on lighter stone. Mallory fires. The man drops mid-step and slides until he wedges against a rock. His partner freezes, then drags him backward by the webbing. Mallory does not fire again. The partner is mostly behind cover, and the shot would be a guess. He refuses to guess. The handler exhales slowly. "That's 8, he says, not as praise, but as confirmation. Mallory keeps his eyes forward. At 11:52 on March 16th, the ridge line becomes a close fight. Grenades pop and echo. Bren guns hammer. The Italians probe and pull back, probe and pull back. Their defense is not collapsing, but it is thinning. Every time they expose themselves, they pay. At 13:10, a New Zealand runner brings an order. Mallory is to be attached temporarily to a company headquarters element for the afternoon, specifically to watch a known Italian observation point that has been directing mortar fire. The handler reads the order and looks at Mallory. "You're moving," he says. "Different rock. Same job." At 13:44, Mallory crawls into a new position, lower, with a longer lateral view. From here, he can see a distinct outcrop on the far side where an Italian observer has been seen with binoculars. The distance is close to 520 yards at this angle. At 14:03, the outcrop stays empty. At 14:16, a man appears behind it. He raises binoculars. He leans forward just enough that his head and upper shoulders are visible against sky. Observers do not carry machine guns. They carry information. They kill indirectly. Mallory sets his sight. He breathes. He holds. At 14:17, he fires. The observer drops out of view. Within 2 minutes, Italian mortar fire slackens. Not stops, but slackens. The pattern loses precision. Rounds land wider. Mallory's rifle has just done what an entire platoon might struggle to do: disrupt a fire control node with one shot. That is not heroism. It is mechanics. The night of March 16th is worse than the first. At 19:28, Italian mortars return with more aggression. At 20:11, flares rise again. At 21:36, a burst of close rifle fire suggests a patrol clash somewhere below the crest. At 23:02, a wounded man cries out and is pulled into cover by 2 others, moving inch by inch. Mallory listens. He cleans the rifle again. He counts his remaining .303 rounds. He has enough for another day if he doesn't waste them. He does not sleep. At 5:09 on March 17th, the third day, the ridge is already hot with gunfire. The Italians are under pressure. Commonwealth artillery has been working the positions through the night. Assault elements are preparing to push again. This is often when defenders become reckless, not out of stupidity, but out of necessity. They have to move ammunition. They have to reposition guns. They have to retrieve wounded. They have to plug gaps. At 5:22, Mallory is back on a rock line with a clear view of the same saddle and traverse areas he has been watching. He is now known in the company. Men bring him information in whispers. They're moving here. They've got a gun there. He does not respond much. He takes the information and turns it into angles. At 5:31, a two-man Italian team attempts to relocate a light machine gun along the saddle, moving the gun first, then the ammunition. They are hunched, exposed, trying to use speed as cover. Mallory picks the man carrying the ammunition. At 5:32, he fires. The ammunition carrier drops and the belt box, or drum, hits the ground and bounces. The second man drops beside him, trying to pull him back. Mallory cycles the bolt. At 5:33, he fires again. The second man collapses over the first. That makes 9 and 10. 10 Italians at roughly 500 yards across 3 days, using iron sights, under mortar and machine gun pressure, with a standard infantry rifle. At 5:34, the handler, now a different NCO, because units rotate and men move, stares at Mallory like he's seeing a new kind of weapon. "Keep watching," he says. "They'll come looking for you now." Mallory doesn't look satisfied. He looks tired. His cheek is raw from the stock. His forearm is bandaged with a strip of cloth. The Lee-Enfield's handguard is cracked. The rifle smells like oil and burnt powder and dust. At 5:38, the Italians do exactly what the NCO predicts. A machine gun opens up on the rock line Mallory fired from. Mortar rounds begin to bracket again. Long, short, closer. At 5:41, Mallory moves. He crawls 10 yards this time, abandoning the comfort of the position he has used for 2 days. He knows the math. 10 kills means attention. Attention means counterfire. Counterfire means death if he stays still. At 5:47, the assault elements surge forward again under smoke and covering fire. Men climb where they were pinned before. Grenades arc, Bren guns chatter. The ridge shifts. Mallory's role shifts with it. Because after 3 days, he is no longer a farm boy with a rifle. He is a resource, rare, effective, and suddenly too important to waste. And the army is about to decide what to do with men like him. At 9:06 on March 17, 1941, the New Zealand Company holds a scraped crestline that did not belong to them 3 days ago. The fighting has not ended. Keren is still contested, the ridges still dangerous, but the immediate pressure on this sector has eased. The Italians are firing less accurately now. Their movement is more cautious. Their counterfire is less coordinated. Mallory lies behind a rock with his rifle across his forearms and listens to the sounds that replace constant gunfire. Men coughing, men whispering for water, the low groan of a stretcher being dragged over stone. At 9:14, a lieutenant arrives with 2 runners and an urgency that does not match his calm face. He is young, but he has learned to keep his voice flat on a ridge where emotion wastes oxygen. "Private Mallory?" he asks. Mallory looks up once. "Yes, sir." The lieutenant kneels in the dust and speaks close, because shouting draws attention. "I'm told you've been doing specialized work," he says. Mallory doesn't respond with pride. He doesn't correct the euphemism. He waits. At 9:16, the lieutenant points at the Lee-Enfield. "Is that the rifle you did it with?" "Yes, sir." "No scope?" Mallory shakes his head. "No, sir." The lieutenant exhales, then nods toward the rear slope where company headquarters is dug in behind a fold of ground. "At 10 o'clock you're coming with me," he says. "You're going to tell the intelligence officer what you saw, where you saw it, and how you did it." Mallory nods once. At 9:19, the lieutenant leaves, and the men around Mallory finally allow themselves to speak openly, because the immediate danger has shifted elsewhere. One of them, still the same skeptic from the first day, leans in. "They're going to make you a bloody legend," he mutters. Mallory doesn't answer. He checks the rifle again. He keeps his hands busy. He knows what men do with stories. They stretch them. They polish them. They turn hard, ugly moments into something clean enough to tell in a mess tent. The ridge was not clean. Nothing about it was. At 10:03, Mallory reaches company headquarters. The HQ is not a building. It is a shallow dugout reinforced with sandbags and stone, covered with a tarp that flaps in the wind. Inside, a captain is studying a map with a pencil, and an intelligence sergeant is writing notes in a notebook that has absorbed sweat and dust. Mallory is told to sit. He is handed water. He is asked to speak. At 10:11, he gives a report the way a practical man reports a broken fence line. Exact points, exact times, exact angles. He points to the notch, the saddle, the outcrop where the observer leaned forward. He marks them on the map with a pencil and a steady hand. The intelligence sergeant asks the obvious question. "How did you range them?" he says. Mallory answers honestly. "By eye," he says. "Using the ground." "What about wind?" "Watched the brush. Watched the mirage. Held off when it pushed." "Did you have a spotter?" Mallory looks at the captain, then back. "Not at first," he says. "Then the corporal started pointing." The captain nods as if confirming a theory he has been holding quietly for months, that the Army is leaving capability on the table by not formalizing it. At 10:23, the captain writes a note. At 10:27, he looks up. "Private," he says, "you understand you can't keep doing this as an ordinary rifleman. Not if we want you alive." Mallory keeps his voice neutral. "Yes, sir." At 10:29, the captain makes it official in the only way he can at this level. He recommends Mallory for attachment to a battalion reconnaissance and intelligence element as a designated marksman, what many units in this era might call a scout sniper, even if the terminology is loose. It is not a glamorous transfer. It is not a ticket out of danger. It is a different kind of danger. At 10:33, Mallory is told to report to the battalion sergeant major at 1600 hours. At 10:35, he leaves headquarters and returns to the ridge with his rifle. The war does not pause for paperwork. By 1350 on March 17th, Italian fire returns in intermittent bursts. The defenders probe again, testing whether the Commonwealth troops are overextended. The fight shifts to adjacent ridges and gullies, and Mallory spends the afternoon doing the same thing he has done for 3 days, watching for the moment a man thinks he is safe. But something has changed. Now the enemy knows he is there. At 14:08, a burst of machine gun fire rakes the rock line where he has not been for an hour. At 14:21, mortar rounds land on positions that had been useful to him on the first day. The Italians are not guessing anymore. They are suppressing likely sniper positions as part of their routine. Mallory adapts by becoming invisible. He does not fire twice from the same rock. He uses shadow. He uses the backside of ridges to move. He fires less. At 15:06, he sees an Italian silhouette at 480 yards. It is a clean shot. The man is exposed. Mallory does not take it, because the target is not important enough to justify the counterfire. That decision, letting a man live because killing him costs too much, changes him more than the act of shooting ever did. It is where the work stops being marksmanship and becomes strategy. At 16:02, Mallory reports to the battalion sergeant major. The man is older, hard-faced, with a voice like sandpaper. He looks at Mallory's rifle, then at Mallory's hands. "You can shoot," the sergeant major says. Not a compliment. A statement of fact. Mallory stays quiet. At 1607, the sergeant major assigns him to a small team, one corporal as a spotter and navigator, one runner, and Mallory as the shooter. Their mission is simple on paper and brutal in practice. Observe enemy movement, identify machine gun positions, disrupt observers and key personnel, and feed information back to companies preparing assaults. At 1612, the sergeant major adds a final instruction. "You'll keep that rifle," he says. "It's what you know. You'll get an optic when we can, but don't wait for it." At 1615, Mallory leaves with a new role and the same weapon. The rest of the East African campaign moves fast. By late March 1941, the pressure at Keren breaks. Italian forces begin withdrawing toward Asmara and Massawa. Commonwealth units push forward. The terrain changes, but the logic stays constant. Whoever controls observation controls casualties. Mallory's team works like a small machine. They move at night. They watch at dawn. They send runners with sketches and range estimates. They pick targets that matter. Observers, machine gun teams, runners, officers who expose themselves to direct men under fire. The Lee-Enfield remains their primary tool. It is rugged. It functions when sand and dust would choke tighter mechanisms. Its 10-round magazine and smooth bolt allow quick follow-up shots when a first hit is not decisive. Its iron sights are dependable, but Mallory learns their limitations even more sharply as he is asked to shoot beyond 500, then beyond 600, where the front post covers entire torsos and the bullet's drop becomes unforgiving. When a scope finally appears, an old, imperfect optic scrounged from stores, it changes some things and not others. It gives him confirmation of what he already senses. It does not remove wind. It does not remove fear. It does not remove the fact that every shot reveals a general area, and counterfire follows. In May 1941, with the East African theater shifting toward mop-up operations, Mallory is promoted to lance corporal. Not because promotions come easily, but because his job requires trust. His commanders want him able to direct others and make calls without waiting for permission. He begins training other men. Not in a classroom. On ridges. In dry gullies. Using rocks and sticks to teach range estimation. Using empty cartridge cases to explain wind drift. Using the simple rule that kept him alive at Keren: if the shot is not worth the return fire, don't take it. He teaches them the mechanics of the Lee-Enfield, running the bolt without lifting the head, maintaining cheek weld, using the sling as a stabilizer, loading with stripper clips under stress. He teaches them to keep the rifle clean in dust, to protect the muzzle, to check sights after a blast. And he teaches them something harder to measure: patience. At Keren, Patience killed 10 men at long range. After Keren, Patience keeps his own men alive. After the campaign, the army keeps using him. He is moved between units as an instructor, then sent to a school for advanced musketry, still not called sniper school in the modern sense, but effectively the same function. He learns formal fieldcraft, stalking, camouflage, hide construction, observation logs, range cards. He learns how to work with artillery observers. He learns how to translate what he sees through a sight into coordinates that can move mortars and guns. His identity changes with the training. He is still a farm boy in his habits, quiet, practical, not impressed by rank, but he is no longer just a rifleman. He becomes a node in the Army's learning process, evidence that specialized shooting and observation are not luxuries. They are force multipliers. After the war, years later, when the noise is gone and the maps have been filed away, Mallory returns to New Zealand and does what many veterans do. He tries to live in a world that does not understand what he has learned. He goes back to work that makes sense. Land, fences, livestock, weather. But the war follows him in small ways. He keeps a notebook. Not a memoir full of speeches, but a practical book of lessons. How to estimate range without instruments, how to read mirage, how to choose positions that don't silhouette, how to decide when not to shoot. In the 1950s, when Commonwealth armies begin formalizing sniper and reconnaissance marksmanship programs more seriously, that kind of knowledge matters. It feeds doctrine. It ends up in training pamphlets, in instructor notes, in the habits passed from one generation to the next. Mallory does not become famous. There is no parade for a man who lay behind rock and waited for a helmet to rise. But in quiet professional circles, infantry instructors, reconnaissance men, range staff, his story becomes a reference point. Not the exaggerated version. The grounded version. A rifleman with a standard Lee-Enfield, iron sights, and discipline, who proved over 3 days on a ridge that marksmanship is not about glamour. It is about control. Control of a notch. Control of a saddle. Control of the single second a man thinks he can stand up. That is the legacy of the farm boy they mocked. Not because he was superhuman,